December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy bombed the Pearl Harbor naval base of Hawaii. While the United States and Japan are officially engaging in diplomatic negotiations for possible peace with Asia, Japan decides to attack United States at the center of its military potential. Considering Pearl Harbor to be geographically perfect for United States to have their Pacific fleet, Japan makes one of its priorities to be victorious in the Pacific area. After 2 hours of bombing, 21 U.S. ships are sunk or damaged, 188 U.S. aircraft are destroyed, 2,403 people are reported dead. The event marked the interest of the United States in World War II and exacerbated the anti-Japanese sentiment in the American population. It's in this context of insecurities and fear that our document stands. In 1942, the president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, issued executive order regarding the Japanese-American population, forcing their relocation. The executive order in 1966 allowed regional military commanders to designate military areas, from which any or all person may be excluded. Although the executive order did not mention Japanese Americans, this authority was used to declare that all people of Japanese ancestry were required to leave Alaska and the military exclusion zones from all of California and parts of Oregon, Washington, and Arizona, except for those in government camps. The relocation of Japanese Americans in the United States during the Second War was the forced internment in the western interior of the country of about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of whom lived on the Pacific coast. 62% of the internees being United States citizens. The document we had to study represented a civilian exclusion order dated from May 3, 1942 and named Instruction to All Persons of Japanese Ancestry. This order was back then signed off by U.S. Army Commanding Lieutenant General G.L. Leavitt, best known today for his vocal support of the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second War. Officially, and as described in the document, the order contained instruction for the said evacuation and relocation of the Japanese population. Those instructions are given by the Western Defense Command and 4th Army Wartime Civil Control Administration. There is one other administration quoted in the text that we might have to define: the Civil Control Station. It was meant to assist in the evacuation by giving advice and instruction, providing services with respect to management, leasing, sale, storage, or other disposition of most kinds of property, as we will describe later. We will analyze this document and answer the question of how did the United States government manage the internment of Japanese Americans during the World War II. We will talk first about the reassuring way instructions were given to the Japanese population to convince them of the good of their relocation. But we will also talk about the reality of those internment, with people being sent in concentration camps and all the consequences that this reality has created.
First of all, the US government gives clear instructions to the Japanese population. Of course, we know precisely who is concerned by this order, as this line states: all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated. Also, the concerned areas are very detailed. The third paragraph says exactly what county is targeted and even which specific street. Moreover, Japanese didn't just have a deadline for when they had to leave, but an exact date of evacuation given May 17. This, in addition to dates to complete each step learned 38 to 39, and these dates are repeated again on the last paragraph. By giving such precise and clear instruction, the government makes it seem less alarming and more legitimate to the population. On top of that, the government uses reassuring words. Line 26 explains that the Civil Control Station is equipped to assist the Japanese population affected by the evacuation. Another word written multiple times is provide, such as in line 29 and 32. where it is explained that a civil control station will provide services and temporary residence elsewhere, similar to provide weekend farm furnished, land 59, with the sentence each family and individual living alone will be furnished transportation. With this vocabulary, it looks like the government is here to help and almost takes care of the population he asks to live. Finally, the term evacuation and its derivation is repeated multiple times throughout the text, then 16, 27, 28, and 41, like it was for the safety of the Japanese population and it was just temporary. Not only does the US government give clear and reassuring words, but also very organized plans to follow, a list of what they are instructed to take, line 43 to 47, and what they are not allowed to bring, line 52 to 53, is given. So for example, Japanese are advised to take bedding, toilet article, clothing, fork, and on, which correspond to what can be carried by the individual or family group, as explained line 49. The US government is in total control of what is going to happen to this population from now on. Starting from the publication of the order, their every step is dictated, as shown from line 24 to the end of the document. A comment that can be made in addition to that is that the evacuation is very fast. The order is dated May 3, 1942. The first instruction must be complete the next day, and the evacuation date is on May 9, being less than a week after the order was published.
However, this instruction hid, perhaps not so well, a harsh reality that Japanese Americans were about to face. Before the internment even started, families were limited in their ability to move freely. Due to Executive Order 9066, the US military created military zones where they were able to monitor and stop any attempt by Japanese Americans to leave the West Coast. This poster states, "No Japanese person living in the above area will be permitted to change residence without obtaining special permission from the representative of the commanding general, and that such permits will only be granted for the purpose of uniting members of a family," which might have sounded reassuring at first, but seems sinister knowing that the government actually only cared about the efficiency of rounding up all persons of Japanese ancestry. Curfews were later issued. Arrests of Japanese Americans were made by the FBI under the pretense of potential treason, leaving their children to become orphans during the war. Japanese Americans were quickly being ensnared until the evictions eventually started. People were forced to pack up whatever they could physically carry, while having to give up everything else. No pets of any kind will be permitted, which is a pretty cruel thing to say to anyone. A recent example of something quite similar would be how the North Korean government suddenly asked the population to give up their pet dogs. No personal items, nor household goods will be shipped to the assembly center. Service related to the management, leasing, sale, storage, or other disposition of most kinds of property meant that Japanese Americans had no choice but to abandon their property. Families lost their homes, business owners lost their stores, but the main thing they all lost was their humanity, being forcefully sent away as if devoid of rights. The document also states that the government will provide temporary residence elsewhere for all Japanese in family groups, and transport persons and a limited amount of clothing and equipment to their new residence, intentionally avoiding to say that this actual temporary residence was no ordinary shelter but concentration camps. Along with their belongings, Japanese Americans were sent to safe camps, where they would have to spend the next few years. Conditions there were terrible. Dozens of people were crammed together in space destined for far fewer people. Toilets were unpartitioned. Everyone lost their right to privacy. At the same time, illness spread quickly because of the poor living conditions and a lack of space. The harsh weather, whether the extreme cold or heat, as well as the storm, took a toll on the weak. Furthermore, armed guards stood in watchtowers, making sure that Japanese Americans wouldn't exit the camps. Anyone who tried to escape risked getting shot, as well as anyone who had the misfortune to step outside the barbed wire fence. Executive Order 9066, among other extreme racial tensions, was a result of excessive fear of Fifth Column activity, in other words, treason, spying, and sabotage, from Japanese Americans, but it in turn resulted in even more fear amid the people, as innocent American citizens were deported without any solid evidence of wrongdoing. Orphans of Japanese ancestry were sent to Manzanar, the most well-known concentration camp, even though there was absolutely no reason to suspect them of being traitors. Most Americans of Japanese ancestry were convicted of the crimes they didn't commit, solely based on racial prejudice.
The last Japanese internment camp closed in March 1946. It's only in 1988 that Congress passed a bill called the Civil Liberties, recognizing that a grave injustice was done to Japanese Americans and that the US government's actions were based on a race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The internment is considered to have resulted more from racism than from any security risk posed by Japanese Americans. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered an official signed apology, and the law mandated that each victim, meaning 80,000 Japanese Americans, would be paid $20,000 in reparation for this injustice. The internment of Japanese Americans stands out as one of the only American programs that denied civil rights and liberties to a group solely on the basis of race. The civil liberties programs acknowledged that detainees were denied their livelihood, their civil liberties as American citizens, that they lost their home and were denied their own profits and assets. The signing ceremony of reparation bill took place in front of many members of Congress of Japanese descent, including Congressman Norman Mineta, a man who was interned when he was a child. The internment of Japanese Americans during the Second War remains one of the lesser known and most shameful incidents of racial discrimination in the American history.